The solitary genius who discovered gravity. The story of Isaac Newton. Prologue. The man who weighed the universe. Imagine being so brilliant that you invent an entire branch of mathematics just to solve a problem. Imagine discovering that the same force that makes an apple fall also holds the planets in their orbits. Imagine unlocking secrets of light, motion, and gravity that had eluded humanity for thousands of years, and doing it all before you turn 30. This is the story of Isaac Newton, a man so far ahead of his time that it took the world centuries to fully appreciate what he had accomplished. A lonely child who became the greatest scientific mind in history. A man haunted by demons, driven by obsession, brilliant beyond measure but tortured by insecurity and rage. This is the story of a genius born into darkness who brought light to the universe. A man who saw further than anyone before him, not because he was taller, but because, as he himself said, he stood on the shoulders of giants. But this is also the story of a deeply flawed human being. A man who could unlock the secrets of the cosmos but couldn't understand human connection. A man capable of breathtaking brilliance and petty cruelty. A man who changed everything we know about reality but spent years of his life obsessed with alchemy, mysticism, and ancient prophecies. This is the complete story of Isaac Newton, not just the genius, but the man. And it's more human, more complicated, and more extraordinary than you can imagine. Chapter 1. Born into Grief. On Christmas Day, 1642, in the small manor house of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire, England, a tiny, premature baby was born. So small he could fit in a quart pot, they said. So weak the women sent to fetch medicine for him thought he wouldn't survive the hour. His father, also named Isaac Newton, never knew his son. He had died 3 months before the boy's birth, leaving behind a modest farm and a pregnant widow. Baby Isaac survived, though no one could explain how. He was so frail, so impossibly small. But there was something stubborn in him, something that refused to surrender to death. It was a stubbornness that would define his entire life. His mother, Hannah, remarried when Isaac was 3 years old. She married a wealthy minister named Barnabas Smith, who had no interest in raising another man's child. Hannah made her choice. She left young Isaac behind with his grandmother and moved to her new husband's house in the nearby village. Imagine it. 3 years old, and your mother abandons you for a new family. 3 years old, and you're left with a grandmother in a world where plague, fire, and early death are everyday realities. Isaac never forgave her. Years later, as a teenager, he would confess in his diary to threatening to burn his mother and stepfather alive in their house. The rage, the abandonment, the loneliness, they burned in him like fire for the rest of his life. Young Isaac grew up isolated, odd, different. He didn't play with other children. He built things instead: sundials, miniature windmills, water clocks, toy carts. His hands were always busy creating mechanical wonders while his mind wandered through landscapes of thought and imagination. When his stepfather died and his mother returned to Woolsthorpe, Isaac was 12. Hannah expected her son to be grateful, but the damage was done. The boy who had been left behind had learned to survive alone. He didn't need her anymore. He didn't need anyone. Chapter 2. The Reluctant Farmer. Hannah had plans for Isaac. He would be a farmer, managing the family estate, living a simple, prosperous country life. It was a reasonable expectation. Isaac was the heir to the property. Farming was an honest living. But Isaac was a terrible farmer. He would be sent to market to sell produce and instead sit under a tree reading a book, completely forgetting his task. He would be told to watch the sheep and instead build water wheels in the stream while the sheep wandered off. He had no interest in crops, livestock, or land management. He was interested in why things worked. Why did the moon hang in the sky? Why did objects fall? What was light made of? What was the nature of color, of motion, of the universe itself? These weren't questions a farmer needed to answer, but they were the only questions that mattered to Isaac. His uncle, William Asco, recognized something special in the boy. He convinced Hannah to send Isaac back to grammar school in Grantham, then to university. Hannah agreed reluctantly. She saw it as a waste of money, but she relented. In 1661, at age 18, Isaac Newton entered Trinity College, Cambridge as a subsizar, a student so poor he had to work as a servant to wealthier students to pay his way. He cleaned their boots, served their meals, ran their errands. It was humiliating for a young man of his pride and intelligence. But it also fueled something in him, a determination to prove himself, to rise above his circumstances through sheer brilliance. Cambridge at that time was teaching outdated ideas, medieval philosophy, ancient Greek physics, Aristotelian logic. But Newton taught himself. He read Descartes, Galileo, Kepler, and Boyle. He filled notebooks with his own experiments and observations, working through problems that the official curriculum ignored. He titled one notebook, Questions Quidem Philosophicae, certain philosophical questions. Under the title, he wrote in Latin, Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my best friend is truth. At 22 years old, Isaac Newton had declared independence from all authority except reality itself. Chapter 3. The Plague Year Miracle. In 1665, the Great Plague struck England. London lost a quarter of its population. Cambridge University closed, sending students home to avoid the contagion. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe, to the farm, to isolation. For anyone else, it would have been a setback, a waste of time. For Newton, it became the most productive period in the history of science. Alone in his room, with nothing but time in his racing mind, Newton began to work on problems that had fascinated him at Cambridge. What was the nature of light? How did objects move? What kept the planets in their orbits? He was 23 years old, and he was about to change everything. First, he revolutionized mathematics. The mathematical tools of the day weren't sufficient for the problems Newton wanted to solve. So he invented new mathematics, what he called the method of flux ions, and what we now call calculus. He developed techniques for calculating rates of change, for understanding curves and motion, for solving problems that had been impossible before. He didn't publish it. He just wrote it down in his notebooks for his own use. Second, he discovered the nature of light and color. Newton obtained a prism and darkened his room. He let a single beam of sunlight through a hole in the shutter, passed it through the prism, and watched it spread into a rainbow spectrum on the wall. Everyone knew prisms created rainbows, but they thought the prism somehow colored the light. Newton proved otherwise. He took the colored spectrum and passed it through a second prism. The colors recombined into white light again. White light wasn't pure, it was a mixture of all colors. The prism didn't add color, it separated colors that were already there. It was a revelation about the fundamental nature of light. Third, and most famously, he developed his theory of universal gravitation. The apple story is true, though not quite as dramatic as the myth. Newton did watch apples fall in his garden. And he did wonder, if gravity pulls the apple down, does it also pull on the moon? Could the same force that operates on Earth also govern the heavens? It was a radical thought. Since ancient times, people had believed the earthly realm and celestial realm operated by different laws. Earth was corruptible, changing, subject to decay. The heavens were perfect, eternal, governed by divine principles. Newton dared to imagine they were the same. The force pulling an apple to the ground was the same force holding the moon in orbit. Gravity was universal. He began to work out the mathematics. If gravity decreased with the square of distance, he could derive Kepler's laws of planetary motion. He could explain the tides, the motion of comets, the orbits of moons. Everything fit together with mathematical perfection. In roughly 18 months, during the plague years of 1665 to 1666, Isaac Newton invented calculus, discovered that white light is composed of colors, and developed the theory of universal gravitation. He was 24 years old, and he told almost no one about any of it. Chapter 4. The Reluctant Professor. When Cambridge reopened, Newton returned and gradually began to share his work with select colleagues. In 1669, at the astonishingly young age of 26, he was appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, one of the most prestigious positions at Cambridge. Now Newton had a platform, resources, and the expectation that he would publish and teach. He was terrible at both. His lectures were sparsely attended, sometimes with no students showing up at all. Newton's lecturing style was dry, technical, and assumed knowledge that undergraduates simply didn't have. He would lecture to empty halls, fulfilling his obligation but clearly uninterested in whether anyone learned anything. But Newton did build something remarkable during this period: a reflecting telescope. All telescopes at the time used lenses, which produced distorted, colored images. Newton designed a telescope that used mirrors instead, eliminating the color distortion. The telescope was a sensation. It was small, just 6 inches long, but it magnified objects as well as a 6-foot lens telescope. The Royal Society was so impressed they invited Newton to become a member in 1672, at age 29. Emboldened by this success, Newton published his work on light and colors. He expected acclaim. Instead, he faced criticism and skepticism. Robert Hooke, one of England's leading scientists, attacked Newton's conclusions, suggesting Newton had merely rehashed Hooke's own ideas. Newton was devastated. He responded with a rage that shocked everyone. He wrote vicious letters attacking Hooke's intelligence and competence. He vowed to never publish anything again, to keep his discoveries private rather than subject himself to the opinions of lesser minds. And for years, he kept that vow. The man who had unlocked fundamental secrets of the universe refused to share them because he couldn't handle criticism. Chapter 5. The Dark Years. From the mid-1670s through the mid-1680s, Newton largely withdrew from physics and mathematics. Instead, he dove deep into alchemy and biblical chronology. Yes, alchemy. The legendary scientist who would become the symbol of rational, mechanistic science spent years trying to transmute base metals into gold, searching for the philosopher's stone, conducting secretive experiments with mercury and other substances. Modern historians have found over 1 million words of Newton's alchemical writings. He worked obsessively heating metals, mixing substances, recording observations in coded language. He believed there were hidden forces in nature, spiritual dimensions to matter that mathematics alone couldn't capture. Newton also threw himself into religious studies with the same obsessive intensity. He learned Hebrew to study original biblical texts. He worked to decode prophecies in the book of Daniel and Revelation. He calculated the dimensions of Solomon's temple, believing its proportions contained divine secrets. And he came to a dangerous conclusion: the doctrine of the Trinity was a corruption of true Christianity. In an age when denying the Trinity could be punished by death, Newton kept his heretical beliefs secret, but they were deeply held and passionately defended in his private writings. These weren't the hobbies of a dilettante. Newton approached alchemy and theology with the same rigorous intensity he brought to physics. He was searching for ultimate truth, divine knowledge, the underlying order of reality itself, whether that reality was physical, chemical, or spiritual. To modern eyes, this seems like a contradiction. How could the man who discovered the law of gravity also waste years on alchemy? But for Newton, there was no contradiction. He was searching for God's design in all its forms. Science, alchemy, prophecy, they were all attempts to decode the divine blueprint of creation. Chapter 6. The Principia, Changing the World. In 1684, the astronomer Edmund Halley visited Newton in Cambridge with a question: what would be the orbit of a planet if gravity decreased with the square of distance? An ellipse, Newton answered immediately. Halley was stunned. This was the problem plaguing the best mathematicians and astronomers in Europe. How do you know? He asked. I have calculated it, Newton replied. Halley begged Newton to publish his proof. After months of persuasion, Newton agreed. But as he began to write up his proof, he realized he needed to develop more mathematics, clarify more concepts, prove more theorems. What was supposed to be a short paper grew into the most important scientific book ever written: Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. The Principia. Newton worked obsessively for 18 months, barely eating or sleeping. Colleagues would find him still in his nightshirt at midday, surrounded by papers, having forgotten to dress. He was possessed by the work, driven to get every detail perfect. The Principia laid out 3 laws of motion that govern all physical objects. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by a force. Force equals mass times acceleration, F equals ma. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Then Newton derived his law of universal gravitation. Every object in the universe attracts every other object with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. From these simple principles, Newton explained everything. The orbits of planets, the motion of comets, the tides, the precession of Earth's axis, why planets closer to the sun move faster, why the moon's orbit wobbles, the paths of projectiles, the behavior of pendulums. For the first time in history, the heavens and earth obeyed the same laws. The universe was a giant clockwork mechanism, governed by mathematical principles that could be understood, predicted, and verified. The Principia was published in 1687, paid for by Halley. Newton had no money for publication costs. It was dense, difficult, written in Latin, filled with geometric proofs that only expert mathematicians could follow. But those who could read it recognized it instantly as one of the supreme achievements of human thought. Newton had done what no one had ever done before. He had unlocked the mathematical laws governing the entire universe. The poet Alexander Pope captured the moment perfectly. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. Newton was 44 years old. He had finally shared his genius with the world. And the world would never be the same. Chapter 7. The Bitter Rivalry. But Newton's triumph was poisoned by conflict. Robert Hooke claimed that he had suggested the inverse square law to Newton, that Newton had stolen his ideas. Newton was furious. He threatened to suppress the third book of the Principia entirely rather than give Hooke any credit. Only Halley's patient diplomacy kept Newton from sabotaging his own masterwork. The feud with Hooke consumed Newton with rage. He systematically removed every reference to Hooke from the Principia. When Hooke died in 1703, Newton showed no mercy to his memory. As president of the Royal Society, Newton ensured that Hooke's portrait was lost and all his instruments disposed of. To this day, no authenticated portrait of Robert Hooke exists. But an even more bitter rivalry was brewing with the German mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz had independently developed calculus in the 1670s and published it in 1684. His notation was different from Newton's, actually superior and easier to use. But Newton had developed calculus first, back in the 1660s, though he hadn't published it. Who deserved credit for inventing calculus? The dispute erupted into one of the ugliest priority battles in scientific history. Newton and Leibniz exchanged accusations of plagiarism. Their supporters formed rival camps. The Royal Society conducted an investigation, which Newton secretly controlled, that declared Newton the sole inventor and Leibniz a fraud. Newton pursued this vendetta with terrifying intensity. He anonymously published attacks on Leibniz. He manipulated the Royal Society investigation. He never forgave, never relented. The sad truth is that both men deserved credit. They had independently discovered calculus using different approaches. There was room for both to be honored. But Newton couldn't share glory. His insecurity, his childhood abandonment, his need to be recognized as supreme, it made him viciously protective of his achievements. He would destroy anyone who threatened his priority. Leibniz died in 1716, broken and embittered, his reputation destroyed by Newton's campaign. Newton had won. But the victory left him isolated, feared, and resented by many in the scientific community. Chapter 8. The Master of the Mint. In 1696, Newton left Cambridge for London to become Warden of the Royal Mint, later promoted to Master. Many thought he was taking an honorary sinecure, a comfortable retirement job. They underestimated him. Newton approached the mint with the same obsessive intensity he brought to everything. England's currency was in crisis. Coins were being clipped, counterfeited, debased. The economy was collapsing. Newton revolutionized the mint's operations. He supervised the Great Recoinage, replacing England's entire currency. He personally interrogated counterfeiters, infiltrated criminal gangs, and sent numerous counterfeiters to the gallows. Yes, the man who discovered the law of gravity spent years hunting down and executing counterfeiters. He was relentless, methodical, and utterly without mercy. Newton became wealthy at the Mint. He invested in the South Sea Company and made a fortune, then lost much of it in the bubble's collapse, proving that even genius doesn't guarantee market timing. He also became president of the Royal Society in 1703, a position he held until his death. He ruled the society with an iron fist, tolerating no dissent, crushing rivals, controlling what research was published and promoted. Newton had become powerful, wealthy, and feared. The lonely boy from Woolsthorpe now dined with nobles and advised queens. But he was still fundamentally alone, still guarded, still unable to form genuine human connections. Chapter 9. The Final Years, Worship and Isolation. In his final decades, Newton was revered as the greatest mind in Europe. Foreign dignitaries visited him. Younger scientists sought his approval. He was knighted by Queen and in 1705, the first scientist ever honored for his scientific achievements. But Newton was not a gracious elder statesman. He was autocratic, thin-skinned, and vindictive. He continued his war against Leibniz even after Leibniz's death. He refused to acknowledge the work of younger scientists who might challenge his supremacy. Yet he could also be generous and supportive to those who properly deferred to him. He mentored young mathematicians, encouraged new research, and gradually allowed a circle of disciples to form around him. Newton never married. There's no evidence he ever had a romantic relationship with anyone. He died a virgin at age 84, having devoted his entire life to understanding the universe rather than experiencing human intimacy. His niece, Catherine Barton, managed his household in his later years. She was beautiful, witty, and socially adept, everything Newton wasn't. She gave him a connection to the social world he had never been able to navigate alone. In his final years, Newton's health declined. He suffered from kidney stones and other ailments. But his mind remained sharp. He continued revising the Principia, working on chronologies, studying prophecies. On March 20, 1727, Isaac Newton died in his sleep in London. He was 84 years old. Chapter 10. The Funeral of a Giant. Newton was given a state funeral, an honor unprecedented for a scientist. His body lay in state in Westminster Abbey. The Lord Chancellor, 2 dukes, and 3 earls served as pallbearers. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, among kings and heroes. The philosopher Voltaire, who attended the funeral, marveled at the honor England bestowed on Newton. I have seen a professor of mathematics, simply because he was great in his vocation, buried like a king who had done good to his subjects. After Newton's death, his papers revealed the full extent of his genius and his strangeness. The calculus he'd invented decades before. The experiments on light he'd never published. The million words on alchemy and prophecy. The economist John Maynard Keynes, after studying Newton's unpublished papers, concluded Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians. It was true. Newton straddled 2 worlds. He was the father of modern science, the man who showed the universe operated by mathematical laws. But he was also an alchemist, a mystic, a biblical scholar seeking divine secrets in ancient texts. He wasn't a purely rational calculating machine. He was a deeply religious man who believed his science was uncovering God's design. He wasn't a modern secular scientist. He was a 17th-century Christian who happened to be the greatest scientific mind in history. Epilogue. The Giant's Shoulders. Isaac Newton's influence on human civilization is almost impossible to overstate. His laws of motion and gravity governed physics for over 200 years, until Einstein's relativity revealed them to be approximations, extraordinarily accurate approximations, of deeper truths. Engineering, astronomy, space flight, ballistics, architecture, all built on Newtonian mechanics. When we send rockets to Mars, we use Newton's equations. When we build bridges or design cars or predict eclipses, we use Newton's physics. His calculus, and Leibniz's independent version, became the foundation of modern mathematics, essential to physics, engineering, economics, and virtually every quantitative science. His experimental method, careful observation, mathematical analysis, testing predictions, became the template for scientific research. But Newton's legacy is complicated by his character. He was undeniably a genius, but he was also petty, vindictive, and cruel. He destroyed rivals. He hoarded credit. He used his power to crush dissent. He advanced human knowledge more than perhaps any single person in history, but he was often a terrible human being to the people around him. Can we separate the achievement from the man? Should we? Perhaps the answer is that Newton was human, brilliantly, tragically, completely human. His genius came bundled with insecurity, rage, and loneliness. His childhood abandonment left scars that never healed. His extraordinary mind was paired with an ordinary capacity for pettiness and pride. Final thoughts, standing on the shoulders of giants. Near the end of his life, Newton wrote to his rival Robert Hooke, in a rare moment of generosity, or perhaps strategic politeness, if I have seen further it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. It's one of history's most famous quotations. It acknowledges that Newton's achievements built on the work of Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, and countless others. But there's also a darker interpretation. Hooke was a short, hunchbacked man. Some historians think Newton's comment was a subtle insult, a reference to Hooke's stature, implying he was no giant. We'll never know for certain. Like so much about Newton, even his moments of humility carry the possibility of hidden cruelty. But the phrase endures because it captures an essential truth. All human achievement is collective. We build on what came before. We stand on the foundation laid by previous generations. Newton stood on the shoulders of giants. And everyone who came after, Einstein, Hawking, every physicist and engineer and mathematician, stands on Newton's shoulders. His genius was real. His achievements were monumental. But he was not superhuman. He was a lonely, insecure, brilliant, flawed person who happened to see patterns in nature that no one else could see. What can we learn from Newton's story? First, that brilliance and kindness are not the same thing. You can revolutionize human knowledge and still be cruel to the people around you. Newton was proof. Second, that genius requires obsession. Newton didn't casually discover the law of gravity. He thought about it constantly, exclusively, to the point of forgetting to eat or sleep. Greatness demands sacrifice. Third, that childhood wounds shape us forever. Newton's abandonment by his mother, his isolation, his need for control, these patterns repeated throughout his life. Understanding this doesn't excuse his behavior, but it explains it. We are all, to some degree, prisoners of our past. Fourth, that science is a human endeavor. It's not conducted by perfectly rational beings but by ambitious, insecure, flawed people seeking truth while also seeking recognition, security, and meaning. Finally, that one person can change the world. A lonely boy from a farm in Lincolnshire, with no particular advantages, unlocked the mathematical structure of the universe. He proved that reality is knowable, that the universe follows rules we can understand. Before Newton, the universe was mysterious, governed by divine whim or Aristotelian philosophy. After Newton, it was a clockwork mechanism, predictable and comprehensible. He gave humanity a new superpower, the ability to predict the future. If you know the positions and velocities of objects and understand Newton's laws, you can calculate where they'll be at any future time. The universe became less magical, but more wonderful, because it made sense. Isaac Newton died over 250 years ago, but we live in the world he created. Every time you drive a car, fly in an airplane, use a computer, or simply stand on the earth confident that gravity will keep you grounded, you're experiencing the world Newton revealed. He was not perfect. He was not kind. He was not even particularly happy. But he was a genius. And he changed everything. The lonely child who fit in a quart pot grew up to measure the universe. The abandoned boy who threatened to burn down his mother's house grew up to illuminate the cosmos with mathematical light. The reluctant farmer who wanted nothing to do with sheep grew up to shepherd humanity into a new understanding of reality itself. Look up at the moon tonight. It orbits Earth not because of divine magic or Aristotelian purpose, but because of gravity, a force Newton discovered, quantified, and explained. That's his legacy. Not perfection. Not sainthood. But understanding. Isaac Newton showed us that the universe is comprehensible, that human reason can unlock nature's secrets, that we are not helpless before the mysteries of existence. We stand on the shoulders of a giant, flawed, brilliant, lonely, magnificent. And from those shoulders, we can see further than he ever imagined. I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. Isaac Newton,